Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, I'm going to show the process of creating an evergreen snippet roll. This is just a mini little slow stitching project that is perfect for beginners. It's actually geared towards beginners because I show all the steps in the process and we only use a single stitch to complete the entire roll. We'll use it in different variations, and there's even a download that you can link to that shows some of these ideas, but it's certainly not necessary. That will be in the show notes. So let's get started.
So let's take a closer look at our Evergreen Postage roll. So here's the completed roll. This can be made into any length you want by using a longer piece of fabric or sewing multiple pieces of fabric together to create that length. And it's made by these components here, and this is what I call an evergreen postage stamp. Clearly it's just a piece of fabric with embroidery, but it's reminiscent of a postage stamp. And when you put it on this piece of fabric, it becomes like that roll of stamps that you used to remember at the post office. So what I do is I take the components and then I design them on my piece of fabric here using other pieces of scrap fabric underneath my stamps. And then I combine all the components by putting my stamps onto that piece. And then I sew around it. And if we take a closer look, we can see all the detail and all the stitches that go into our project. For your project, this is where it gets creative and you use what you have. You'll need fabric. Now, the most of the fabric you're going to use is going to be for the background. And so here I have just cotton muslin, and it's in strips, approximately 3 inches tall, and I have about 18 inches here in the strip, but we won't use the full 18. If you don't want to use fabric, or if you want a different look, feel free to use ribbon. Nice thick ribbon that you have, and this will create a nice background as well. This happens to be burlap, but you can use any type of ribbon for the background. And then if that's the case, you'll adjust the size of your stamps accordingly. So you won't use a 3-inch tall stamp on this 2-inch ribbon. But that's an easy enough thing to remedy. So I have my background fabric, and then I have the fabric that I selected here. It's a neutral, and I'm going to use this to actually make my stamps. And so I'll cut that down to size. I also have some cotton batting here that I'm going to use just to give a little body, and I'm just going to use this on the stamps themselves. You don't need very much, and if you don't have batting, you can use felt, or you can use an additional piece of fabric, or you can omit it and not use any of that. Then I just have some scrap fabrics here, cotton scraps that I just love these colors, and so these are going to be the colors combined with these for my roll. I'm also going to use a marking pen. I use some thin thread to do some teeny repetitive stitches. I use embroidery floss, and I chose evergreen colors here, the brown for the trunk and just green for the tree and the branches. You can use a variation of this. You can use any color you want. You don't have to be limited to these colors, and you can use multiple colors as well. I have a pair of fabric scissors and just little thread snips to cut my thread. I also have a pin cushion with pins, and then I have 2 sewing needles, a thinner one for my thinner fabric and a thicker one for my embroidery floss. I might use a few other tools as I go along, and I'll explain those in detail. Now, I know for my backing, and I'm going to use 2 pieces here. I have a piece that I'm going to actually sew and adhere my stamps to, and then I'm going to do all my stitching, and so then after my stitching is complete, I want to put an additional piece on the back to hide my stitches. So that's why I use 2. If you're going to use ribbon for this step, just make sure you have 2 of the same lengths for the same reason. When you cut your fabric, I like to have a nice little rough edge, and to do that with cotton fabric, you just take your fabric, and it can be the entire length of the piece from selvage to selvage or any size piece, and then I measure how wide I want the strips, and so I want 3 inches. So on the 3-inch mark, I'll just make a little snip, and I like to make it 1 inch or so, and then I gently and firmly pull my fabric apart, and it rips right down the length in a straight line. And so that's how I made my 3-inch strip of cotton fabric. If you don't like that rough edge, use a pair of scissors and you can make your cut, mark it out carefully, and then make your cut accordingly. So when I cut my batting, I cut them each to 1.5 inches by 2.25 inches. I want them to go under my postage stamps when I'm doing my stitching, so it gives it a little height, but I don't really need it to be bigger than that. To do this, I just take a pair of fabric scissors and I just cut. I don't tear my batting apart. I just measure it, make the cut, and then I have these nice edges. And you can cut this with pinking shears or scallop shears as well. You don't have to use straight edges. So that's our batting. And so here I've cut my fabric for my stamps. I chose a neutral fabric and I just cut them to the size 3 inches by 2.5 inches because I know that it's going to fit nicely on the strip of fabric I'm going to use for the background. When I eventually sew it, I'm going to take my stamp fabric, as I call it, put my backing centered on it, and then I'll be able to make my stitches of my trees. Now you have some options. You can just make a nice sharp cut. It will unravel, and you can use this to your advantage by just pulling the edges a little so that they unravel a little further, and you get that rough edge. And I really like that, and that's the edge I'm going to use today. I won't pull it apart until after I'm done with my embroidery. But you don't have to stop there, and this is where you choose to make it personal. Here I have a pair of pinking shears, and these are shears that have teeth that make zigzags, and you cut them across on each end of the fabric, and your fabric won't unravel or fray because of those little blades and those cuts. And so if you want, you can make your stamps with the pinking shears. And likewise, if you happen to have a pair of scalloped fabric scissors, you can do the same thing, and that produces a scalloped edge, a little more traditional, like a postage stamp. So once you have all your pieces, and I'm doing 5 of each, so I have 5 pieces of batting, 5 stamps, and then 2 strips of my background, we can start. Now to make a straight stitch, and that will be the simplest stitch, and we'll use variations of it to make our trees. All I do is I take my needle and my thread, and I'm using a piece of embroidery floss with all 6 strands left intact. If you want to use a thinner piece, just unravel the floss and use the pieces from there. After I thread my needle, I come back to the end of it and I'll make a nice thick knot in the base. And so I just make a knot and then I'll just double it. So I make 1 knot and then I'll just create another one and try and get it close to the first one. Now to make a straight stitch, it's just a simple stitch. I'll make an exaggerated version up here. I just take my needle, poke it through my fabric, and here I'm using an embroidery hoop and just some muslin fabric. I don't tend to use an embroidery hoop when I'm doing my slow stitching. I just haven't gotten to the habit of it. But it is nice for when I'm showing it on film. So I make my first stitch, and then I bring my stitch down according to whatever stitch length I want. And I pull it, but not so snug, but just so that it's not loose. This would be a loose stitch with a little loop, or even you can even pull it a little further where it's just a little loose. And you don't want to pull it too tight where you see your fabric moving. So I just like to go in there and just make sure it's there, but not too loose. And then from there you can continue that stitch making a line. And the way you do that is from underneath your fabric, you bring your needle and you poke it up. But if you want it to be in line, you might take a few tries. So you just go in, and when you have that placement, then you pull your fabric through. And you do it gently. You don't want to twist your fabric if you can avoid it. And then your goal is to match that stitch size that you had for the first one. And you pull it again. And you can continue this the entire length if you wish. The way you finish off a stitch is you just turn your piece over, and I can see here that my fabric knotted, so I didn't get an accurate stitch. This one came out very easily. I just had to manipulate the floss, then I just make sure it's not tangled on itself, and then I can just gently pull it down, and I can verify it looks good here and it looks good here. So to finish that stitch, now that I've realized it was tangled up, I got the tangle out. I'm going to take my needle and go under the nearest stitch, not the fabric, just the embroidery floss. And then I'm going to pull that needle through that stitch on the bottom, and when I have a little loop at the end, I'll double back through it. And now when I pull that fabric, it's knotted and secure, and I'll just trim it off. So that's a basic straight stitch. So now when you're filling in an area with your stitches, very similar to painting, you can decide the length of your stitches, which would be the length of your brush stroke, and the distance between each stitch. So that would be like when you're painting, if you want to paint in a circle completely, you'll have some overlap where the paint will overlap with each other. And we'll do the same thing with stitches. You can create a very wide-spaced tree or a tight tree using the same technique. So to do that, I'll just take my pen and I'll create a triangle. I'll do a second one here. So to do this, using straight stitches, I just practice with my needle here, and I'm going to want to find the point, the furthest point, come up with my thread, and go to the furthest point the other side. And since I want wide-spaced stitches, I'll continue this process, going up and down, filling in that triangle. Now I'm really exaggerating how wide I'm making them here. If I was doing them elsewhere, I may or may not do them this wide. But it makes a nice visual, and I think you get the idea. So now using the same technique, on this triangle, I'm going to do the same thing, using the same procedure, but I'm just going to create very tightly spaced stitches as opposed to the widely spaced. Again, I poke my needle maybe a few times until I get it in the proper spot. And that's all there is to it. It's not complex, and it's actually very rewarding. In just a few stitches, I'll have this tree done, or at least the greenery part of it. And so there we have the wide stitches and the tightly spaced stitches. You can also invert this, and instead of doing them from left to right, you can do them up and down as we have here. And then you can do the same technique, but using wonky lines that we have here. And by wonky, I mean instead of trying to go straight across, I might have a little angle, and the lines will not be parallel, and I won't try and make it parallel. You can do cross stitches, and the same thing here is where I want overlap. So if I'm doing stitches with the intention of having another triangle, I'll come from different angles and I'll purposely cross over. And again, I'll still try and keep them within the triangle shape that I'll have penciled down. The concentric triangle is just taking that triangle, and this one takes a little more practice because I like to just go over it. So I start here, go up like this, and I like to start at the base. And I'm just making little stitches to create a running line right across. And again, if I have a knot on the back, I'll just pull gently on the fabric. And while I try and get all my stitches the same size, sometimes it doesn't work out that way, and that's okay. I'll just work it, really trying to stay on that line. And using this method, you can make any shape. You can just do an outline. You don't have to do concentric triangles, but it's the same technique. So there we have the 4 ways we can vary the straight stitch to have 4 different effects: by the stitch length, the stitch spacing, crossing over your stitches, or creating them in succession to make a line. So now to make our sketches, I have my batting and I have my little bit of stamp fabric here, as well as my marking pen, and you could use a colored pencil as well. So now I'm just going to create each one of these with that rough triangle. And my goal is to just make that perimeter fairly accurate. As you can see, it's not pristine, but it's effective, and I can see it and I can use it as my guide. You can make your trees different shapes, different widths, and that's up to you. So I like to do that first. Then what I do is I take my backing, my batting backing, and I'll put it right in the center of my stamp piece here. And then I just put 2 pins. And I put 2 because I know that as I'm stitching, I'm going to remove one, and I like to have one holding it. So I'll do this with all the pieces, and then we'll come back and start our first evergreen. Now, when you start on a skein of embroidery floss, there are 2 little paper tabs holding it together. If you look for the tab that doesn't have the brand name on it, but the one with the barcode, and you can usually rifle around here and you'll find a little piece of cut embroidery floss. And then you just gently hold your embroidery floss and you can gently pull out some embroidery thread. I use about 2 feet long segments for each time, and sometimes I can do a whole tree with this amount, and sometimes I have to rethread my needle with a new piece. But 2 feet long is pretty good for reducing knots on my thread, as well as using beeswax. So I've threaded my needle, I am making the knot at the end, and then I'll just take a little bit of beeswax and I just take my thread and run it through the beeswax right up to the needle. And this cuts down on tangles with my thread. It doesn't eliminate them, but it does make them a little bit easier to use. So now I have my first triangle here, and I'm going to start my first evergreen. And I'm going to work on the wonky lines first. I'm going to remove a pin so I only have one, and I'm putting it right up top because I like to start at the bottom line. And the first stitch that I make, I like to make mostly parallel. I pull it in, secure it, and then I pull it down. Now that's too tight, so I'll just relax the thread, make that loop, and just gently pull it. Then I'll move up just a little bit a ways from where my thread ended, and I'll pull it. And again, I don't want it to be too tight, so I can loosen it up. And then I'm going to make just a little slight angle here. And then I'll come back and I'm going to go very close to the thread where I went down into my piece, and I'll make an even more of an angle. And then I'm going to again do the same thing, come very close. I'm going to go down kind of parallel to the stroke, the stitch that we made, and then I'll change it up a little. And the beauty of the wonky lines is that your eye ties it together, the triangle shape, and then when we put the trunk it'll look like a tree, but in the meantime it's a little abstract and a little bit of fun. So I'll continue this, and if there's a big gap like there is here, I might go back in to break up that piece, and I might cross over a little just every now and again. There's no harm in that. And then I'll come up and I'll continue. I can remove my pin, and again it might take me a few tries to get that needle in the correct position, but I just keep doing that. Almost done with this tree. You can go back and add as much thickness, keeping the lines tight together, or not, as you'd like. And once you're happy with the tree, I'm going to flip it over, go to the nearest stitch, and go and finish off the piece by knotting my loop. And there we have our first tree. For our second tree, I'm going to do the angles here, and I'm going to try and gradually increase them as I go down. So I'll take one of my trees and I'm going to start at the top. So I'll remove my top pin, and then I'm going to create my first upside down V, where I just choose a distance right on that sketched line that we made, and I go from the sketched line right to the top. And then I'm going to go equal distance on the other sketched line right opposite of it. And I pull that in gently, and I bring that right to the top as well. So now I have my V. I'm going to skip a little bit of space, and I'm going to create an imaginary line straight down the side of the tree, and I'm going to create my first stitch. So I'm going to pull it up from the center, and I'm going to go out right to the side of the line. And then I'm going to match that identically across so that it's symmetrical, and bring it back to right where I came in on the first or the second V, but my first stitch on that piece. And then I'll do the same thing. I go a little lower, and I bring my stitch down. I'll go directly across, pull it up, and I'll continue this, maybe 2 more stitches. So I start down, and I'm increasing the length and the size each time as I go. The first stitch that I make on the right hand side dictates the size of the stitch, and then I just try and match it on the left hand side. So because we have our sketch of the triangle for the tree, I vaguely know the correct height and the placement. And then I'll do one more. I come right to the middle, and I'll go right to that bottom piece. And the same thing over here. And there we have our second tree. I'll finish off the back, and we'll set this aside, and at the end we'll come in and work on all the trunks at once. For our third tree, I'm going to take our little stamp here with the batting, and I'm going to do this piece here, this tree here, the stitch lines off a center line. So I'm going to take out my top needle, my top pin, and I'm going to go in there right at the top with a stitch, and I've already knotted my thread, and I'm going to go all the way down, and I'll go, all the way down to where my trunk is going to start. Gently pull it, and then I'm going to come up here to the corner on the right hand side at the base, and I'm going to do my first stitch straight across, corner to corner. And now as I go up the tree, I'm going to just introduce a little angle. So it's very similar to our wonky lines tree, but we have that middle piece. The lines aren't perfectly straight, some are, but I'm not going for that. So sometimes I'll come in and exaggerate a different shape line. And the number of branches you put on the tree is completely up to you. I'll finish this off, and then we'll start our next tree. For our fourth tree, I'm going to use the speckling technique, and that's a fun one. I have my outline here of my tree, and that's where I'm going to pay attention to. And other than that, anything goes. All my stitches, I'm going to start off with them on the perimeter line. They're going to be short little stitches, and they're all going to face inside the tree. Not the same angle, they're not all pointing towards the center, but they are going to be a little haphazard, and I'm just going to work on filling in that area. After I have the perimeter done, then I'll go in and fill in the area in the center of this triangle. I find if I start out at the bottom, I tend to have a little bit better luck at a cohesive piece. And then I'll just go up the length of the tree. And again, I like to start at the perimeter, and that way I'm guaranteed that my speckling shape will look like a triangle. I like to do small stitches, but I also like to vary them. And every now and again I throw in a bigger stitch. This speckling technique is particularly effective for our evergreen tree because it reminds me of a pile of needles on the floor. And then I'll work my way down, just adding stitches where there seems to be none. And when you have your tree the way you like, finish the back, and then we'll start on our last tree. Now for our last tree, I'm going to use a series of dashes. Once again, you get to choose the direction of your dashes. In this example, they're going up and down. They can go side to side. They can go diagonally. And now you can decide how you'd like to space them as well. So I'm just going to remove the pin and just lower it beneath my triangle. And the same thing over here. I'll bring it above my triangle. And then I'm going to start. And I like to start at the top since I'm doing an up and down stitch. I make my first stitch right from the top, and I just choose the length that I want it to be. And then for my next stitch, I'm going to come in here on the line, and I'm going to just bring it down. I'm going to start it a little lower than the top of my triangle, and so that means I'm going to bring my stitch length down just a little lower than that first stitch. And then I'll do the same thing on this side. I'm going to come in and bring that stitch a little lower so it's almost symmetrical to that second stitch we made. Then I'm going to go in the center again and go down, and I'm going to work my way down. I'm going to come across here, and I'm going to go just still within that second row of stitching, but on that perimeter that we drew of that triangle, and I want to bring that stitch down. Then I'm going to work my way back to the center. Again, my stitch is a little lower this time. I'll come back up, bring the stitch in, and then I'm going to meet right on this line here on this side of the triangle, and I'll bring that stitch down and fill out that area. And I'll continue this until I get that triangle shape. Again, just bringing it lower incrementally each time. If you want to just do the perimeter first, that's totally fine as well. But I like to start at the top and kind of work my way down. Come to this other side and work my way down. The key here is that all the stitches are facing the same direction. You can decide if you want the base of the tree to be a perfect triangle, or if you want it a few stitches a little bit lower than that triangle you created. And I tend to like that look, where it's not a lot lower, but just enough to make the eye look like it's not a perfect triangle. For my stitch right on the end here, just do a small little stitch. Then I'll work my way across to the other side and fill out any spaces that remain. And again, I'll have that little stitch on the side just to tie it together. I'll knot it off on the back, and then next chapter we'll come in and work on the tree trunks. So now for the tree trunks. I only do 1 or 2 stitches really for each of the tree trunks because I think it's very effective. And I switch my color, so now I have a brown thread on my needle. And I look at the tree and I see which direction I want the trunks to be. Some trunks I want to go vertically, and some I want them to go back and forth. So this one I'm just going to do vertically, and I think I'll just do 2 or 3 stitches. I'll eyeball where the center of the tree is, and then I'll just put 2 stitches, and I get to choose how long I want the tree trunk to be. In some cases I want it to be really long, and in some cases very short. And then I'll just go on the back and knot my thread. And I'll speed this along, but you can see the process where I do each one of these using the same method, but I determine which way I want the stitches to go. Sometimes the thread escapes the needle, and that's just the way it goes. So now we have all our trees completed. At this point, I'll go around and just gently pull up and fray the edge ever so slightly on each of the pieces. So now we have our two pieces of fabric, and the one that's for the backing I'm going to set aside for now. So I have my singular piece here of fabric, and this is the piece that we're going to adhere everything to. And then I have my other scrap fabrics, as I call them, and these are pieces that I'm going to use to put on the back of my stamps, and then I'll put my stamps on top of them. And so they serve as just an area of interest and something to tie my piece together. And I use greens, the same color as the thread, as well as these neutrals, which are the same piece as the stamp here. So now I just start by playing around with each of the fabrics and seeing where I want to put them. I like to start with a couple of horizontal lines. So depending on the piece of fabric I'm using as my backing, if it's a pattern and I want it to show through, I'll make my horizontal lines a little bit thinner. And I try to keep it somewhat symmetrical, more like balanced than symmetrical, but I like to work from either side towards the center. So here I have a piece here and a piece here, and this is really just playing around and seeing what works. And I'll speed this along, but you can see my process. So there I have my scrap fabrics put down, and now I'll decide where I want my trees to go. I can look at the trees and see approximately if there's any particular order that I want the trees to be in. And then I just work from the outside in. So that's roughly the placement I want. I think I'll start with this one in here. So once I have my fabric in place the way I like it, I'll tack it down. And I'll start at the edge and tack down the scrap fabric and then work over each of the stamps. So now I'm going to tack down each of the stamps, and I'll show you on the first one. I do the same stitch that we have, the basic straight stitch, and I just make little small stitches, and I try and keep them in a fairly neat line, and I just go around the perimeter of each of these stamps. It's a little time consuming, but the results are worth it. And I also find it very relaxing. You can vary the length of your stitches. You can do the same size stitch. It's totally up to you. You just want to make sure that your stitches go through all the layers You want to make sure you catch the background as well as any layers you've built up underneath in the collage and your stamp. When I get to the end, I'll come in from behind again and start going down the length of the stamp. And this secures it very well as giving a nice overall design flair with the border that we're just putting in. And as you sew with the raw edges that we have, little wisps of fabric, little clippings will come up. And so just remove them as you come across them. It's very rewarding to get to a spot where you can remove a pin from your work. This is something you can do on the couch, you can do while waiting in a doctor's office, sitting in the car waiting for your kids to come out of school. There are plenty of opportunities where you only have a few minutes, but you can do something very calmly, and that produces a result. So now I've tidied up any of the scrap fabric for the background that's moved. I've threaded my needle with a knot on the end, and I just want to show you my technique for doing the slow stitching. I like to do that for the pieces in between the stamps, and that helps the stamps pop. So I'm just going to come in from the back, and I'm just going to create that speckling effect that we made for this tree here, but I'm not going to do it as tight. So I'm just going to create a little stitch and pull, and then I'll just continue that all the way around where my collage fabric is. And I'll just show you on this one piece, and then I'll show you the result when it's all complete. Now you can vary the size of the strokes. Once again, you can make little strokes. You can make them all going in the same direction. You can make just a series of lines. It's totally up to you. I like the haphazard look of the speckling. And I just go around all the spots, trim off any loose threads that I come across at the end. And I'll even throw in a few stitches here on just this white background. I think it adds texture and a little cohesion to our piece. Continue down to the bottom, and then I'll be back when it's all complete to show you how it looks with all these stitches put in the background. So there we have our completed snippet roll. I finished all the little stitches as well as attaching the stamps. The only thing left to do is attach the back piece. So for that technique, I have a couple of options. I can glue it with fabric glue right down. I can sew it with another running stitch, or I could adhere it with a fusible adhesive, which is what I think I'm going to do. So I'll just take the iron to it and attach it. So here's our completed piece. We have all our stitching done, and then I fused onto the back just a piece of fabric as you saw in the beginning. That step is completely optional. It can be sewn on or glued on or even left off entirely. But there we have our Evergreen Postage roll. So here's another variation. Using the same techniques, I use printed fabric for the background instead of plain, and this is just a little plaid here. I have all my trees, a few more than we did in class today. I used a white background, so there's quite a bit of contrast between the tree and the stamp. I also used a pair of scalloped edge scissors to cut each of the stamps, and it's kind of a very fun effect. I also fused a backing piece to the background so you could see what that looked like. Now, we discussed in the beginning of class, if you don't want to use a fabric background, which is totally fine, you can use a ribbon. So here's one that I did with ribbon. It's much smaller. I didn't coat the back with anything, so you can see all my stitches. I still can coat the back, but I thought I was going to wrap this around a bucket anyway. Again, I have my trees that I've done here and the background, and these were all super neutral colors. Now I have one more. It's quite a variation. I also used ribbon, and this time it was the burlap ribbon. I did not coat the back. You can see all my stitches. But instead of making individual stamps, I did one little forest. And so the way I did this is I just overlaid my triangles wherever I wanted them. I went in and embroidered in the same manner. And then I embroidered with clear with matching thread to this background and it really didn't stand out, so I went in there with this gold thread that I attached the lace to over here. I think the lace and the burlap and the white and the trees are such a nice contrast, so that gives me more options and a different look.
So that's how I create my slow stitched evergreen roll. I think it's just a beautiful addition. You can make those individual stamps and use them as ornaments or in your project, or you can combine them into this snippet roll and wrap around a vase or a jar. It makes for beautiful decor. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. And thanks for joining me today.